My family took everything from me. My inheritance, my home, my childhood memories. After my father's funeral, they left me with nothing but the dust and shadows of his old study, a room that hadn't been touched for a decade. They thought it was a final, poetic insult, a way to lock me away with the ghost of the one person I thought had loved me, only for his will to prove he didn't. But what they didn't know, what they never could have guessed, is that in their rush to get rid of me, they'd left me the one thing my father truly valued, his secrets. And I was about to use his own words, his own elegant script, to burn their world to the ground. The day my father was buried was the day I officially became a ghost. The sky over the cemetery was a flat, unforgiving gray, a perfect mirror of the mood. My mother, Diana, stood at the head of the grave, a perfect porcelain doll of grief, clutching a black lace handkerchief she never once raised to her eyes. Beside her was my older brother, Marcus, his jaw set, his expensive suit looking more like armor than clothing. He was the heir apparent, the golden boy, the one who'd never set a foot wrong. And on his other side was my sister, Amelia, dabbing delicately at her dry eyes, her husband's hand resting possessively on her back. A perfect portrait of a grieving family, polished, composed, and completely impenetrable. I stood a few feet away, separate as I always had been. The black dress I wore felt borrowed, a costume for a role I was never taught how to play. I was the family's footnote, the artistic one, the one who disappointed my father by choosing literature over law, the one my mother openly called her failed project. While Marcus was groomed for the boardroom and Amelia was molded into the perfect socialite wife, I was just left. A quiet, observant weed growing in the cracks of their manicured garden. Later that day, we were all summoned to the sterile, intimidating office of my father's lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. The room smelled of old paper and even older money. My family sat on one side of the mahogany desk, a united front. I sat on the other, a solitary island. Mr. Abernathy, a man who'd known me since I was a child, wouldn't meet my eyes as he cleared his throat and opened the thick document that held all our futures. As per the final will and testament of Mr. Alastair Vance, he began, his voice a low drone, the family company, Vance Consolidated, and all its assets will be transferred to his son, Marcus Vance. Marcus nodded, a flicker of triumph in his eyes he quickly hid. No surprise there. It was always going to be Marcus. The family estate, including the primary residence and the summer home in the Hamptons, is to be left to his wife, Diana Vance. My mother let out a small, theatrical sigh, as if this was some heavy burden and not the multi-million-dollar prize she'd been angling for her entire married life. To his daughter, Amelia, Abernathy continued, he leaves a trust fund in the amount of $10 million to be managed by her husband. Amelia smiled, a quick, sharp smile she aimed at her husband, who squeezed her shoulder. A team. They were all a team. Then silence, a thick, heavy silence that pressed down on me. Mr. Abernathy shuffled his papers. My mother examined her fingernails. Marcus stared straight ahead. And for me, I finally whispered. The words felt like sandpaper in my throat. Mr. Abernathy finally looked at me, his eyes full of a pity that felt worse than any anger. To his youngest child, he read, his voice barely audible, he leaves his personal effects currently housed within his private study at the main estate. He asks that you clear them out within 30 days. The air rushed out of my lungs. It wasn't just being disinherited. It was the deliberate, calculated cruelty of it. He didn't leave me nothing. He left me his junk, his leftovers, a room full of old books and papers, a monument to a relationship I had obviously imagined. I looked across the desk at my family. My mother's lips were curled into a faint, satisfied smirk. Marcus looked bored. Amelia was already whispering to her husband, probably planning a shopping trip. The ride back to the estate was silent. They didn't speak to me, as if the will had made me invisible. When we arrived, my mother paused at the foot of the grand staircase. "You know where the study is," she said, her voice cold. "The staff will get you boxes, try not to make a mess, and 30 days, not 31. She turned and swept up the stairs, her perfect children in her wake. I was left standing in the grand marble foyer, the silence of the house screaming at me. They hadn't just cut me out of the will. They had erased me from the family. They had made me a ghost in my own home, I stood there for a long time, humiliation and grief churning in my stomach like acid. Then I took a deep breath and walked towards the one part of the house that was now mine, my father's study. The place where my revenge began. My father's study was at the end of a long, dark hallway on the ground floor, a part of the house we were never supposed to visit. The heavy oak door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a room suspended in time. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, dancing in the single beam of afternoon light piercing the heavy velvet curtains. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old leather, pipe tobacco, and decaying paper. It was the scent of my father. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it. The room was his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with legal texts and classic literature. A large, imposing desk littered with pens and a dusty blotter. In the corner, two worn leather armchairs faced a cold fireplace. This was the room they'd given me, a tomb. For the first few days, I did nothing. I just sat in one of those leather chairs, breathing in the silence and the dust, paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of my new reality. No money, no home, no family. They had one. They'd cast me out with such casual indifference it felt like I'd never existed at all. The 30-day deadline loomed over me like a guillotine. On the 5th day, I finally made myself move. I had to pack. I had to get out. I started with the desk, a mahogany monstrosity that held 1,000 secrets in its drawers. The top ones were filled with the mundane, old stationery, dried-up pens, paper clips. I swept them all into a box numbly. And then I got to the bottom right-hand drawer, the one that always stuck. That's when my world shifted on its axis. I had to jiggle it, pulling hard until it gave way with a loud crack. It was deeper than the others, and at the very back, under a stack of old tax returns, was a small brass key. It was ornate, old-fashioned. I pocketed it and kept working. An hour later, clearing a bookshelf, my fingers brushed against a book that felt different. A thick volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. When I pulled it from the shelf, it was too light. I opened it and found the pages had been hollowed out. Inside, nestled in the cavity, was a lock. A small brass lock that matched the key from the desk. My hands were shaking as I inserted the key and turned it. With a soft click, the false book front swung open, revealing a hidden compartment carved into the wall. It wasn't a safe. It was something far more personal. It was a shelf, and on that shelf, lined up in perfect chronological order, were 20 identical leather-bound journals. I reached in and pulled one out. The leather was soft and worn. On the first page, in my father's familiar, elegant handwriting, was a date from 30 years ago. I sank to the floor, the dusty carpet scratching my legs, and began to read. I was in a tomb, all right, but they had made one fatal error. They left me a map to every single body buried there. The first journal started innocently enough. It was filled with my father's thoughts on work, his musings on philosophy, his hopes for his family. He wrote about Marcus's first steps, Amelia's first words. He even wrote about me. He called me his little firefly, the quiet observer, the one with the old soul. For a few hours, the words were a balm on my wounded heart. I let myself believe this was all a terrible mistake, that the man who wrote these words could never have hurt me. But as I moved from one journal to the next, a different story emerged. The loving father started to fade, replaced by a man I didn't recognize. Bitter, resentful, and trapped. The secrets weren't laid out plainly. They were tucked between lines of corporate strategy and complaints about the weather, coded in initials and vague references. But I had a lifetime of experience observing my family. I was fluent in their silences. With every page, the web of their deceit became clearer. The first thread was my brother, Marcus, the golden boy. For years, my father wrote about the pressure to maintain the family's legacy. Then, about 10 years ago, the tone shifted. Entries about Marcus's recklessness and creative accounting. A late-night confrontation, a tearful confession from my brother about a hole in the books. Marcus, it turned out, had a massive gambling problem. He'd been embezzling from the company for years, using shell corporations to cover his debts. My father hadn't been proud. He'd been terrified. The diary entry from that night was chilling. "I have a choice," he wrote. "Expose my son and ruin the family name, or bury his crime so deep it can never be found. A legacy is a fragile thing. Sometimes you have to cut off a limb to save the body. But what if the poison is in the bloodline itself?" He chose to bury it. He used his own money and legal skills to patch the hole, to erase every trace of Marcus's crime. He'd saved his son, but the resentment festered. Marcus wasn't the prodigy. He was the first great failure, propped up by lies. I found the names of the shell corporations, the account numbers, the dates. My father was nothing if not meticulous. He had recorded the evidence of the crime he helped cover up. Next was Amelia, my perfect sister, whose marriage was the envy of their social circle. A complete sham. My father wrote about her frequent shopping trips to New York, which were really rendezvous with another man. A man my father knew well, a powerful business rival he both respected and despised. The affair had been going on for over a decade. "She thinks I don't know," he wrote one evening. "She flaunts her happiness like a stolen jewel. Her husband is a good man, a dull man, but a good one. He deserves better than a wife who whispers another man's name in her sleep. She's playing with fire, and one day the entire house will burn down." My father had even found and hidden letters the lover had sent Amelia, letters she'd carelessly left behind. They were passionate, explicit, and utterly damning, tucked between the pages of the journal like little paper bombs. But the most devastating revelation was about my mother, Diana. The journals from the last 5 years of my father's life painted a horrifying portrait. She wasn't just cold, she was a master manipulator. My father's health had been failing for years, something they'd hidden from me. As he grew weaker, my mother's influence grew stronger. He wrote about how she would constantly whisper poison in his ear about me, how my artistic pursuits were a waste, how I was ungrateful. "Diana speaks of her as if she is a stranger, a stain to be removed," he wrote. "She isolates me, tells me the other children agree. She says I am the only one who cannot see her for what she is. Am I going mad? Have I been blind?" The final journal was the worst. The entries were short, the handwriting shaky. He wrote about a new will, about my mother and Marcus standing over him, guiding his hand, about feeling confused, medicated. The last coherent entry was a single, heartbreaking sentence. "They have taken my name, my money, and now my own mind. There is only one thing left they cannot touch, a final secret for my firefly. The key is in the tragedy." The tragedy, Shakespeare's tragedies, the hollowed-out book, it was a message. For me. I went back to the hidden compartment, my hands shaking. Behind the journals was a false back. I pried it open, and inside was a single, sealed envelope. In it was a key to a safe deposit box and a letter, written in my father's strong hand from years before. Explained everything. He'd known the family was rotting from the inside. He'd been too weak, too proud, too afraid to stop it. So he had created a separate fortune, a secret one, legally siphoning off funds for decades into an account my mother and Marcus knew nothing about. It was his real legacy, he wrote, and it was all for me. The letter ended with a final, chilling instruction. "They built their empire on my silence. Use my voice to bring it to ruin. This is not revenge. This is justice." For 30 days, I lived in that study. I ate there, I slept there. I meticulously scanned every incriminating page, every letter, every account number. My grief hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. My father hadn't disinherited me. He had armed me. My 30 days were almost up. I packed the journals and the contents of the safe deposit box, which held my inheritance and even more of my father's evidence, and moved into a small, anonymous apartment in the city. A ghost no one was looking for. For 2 months, I was silent. I let them sink comfortably into their new, me-free reality. Then, I began to plant the seeds of chaos. First, Marcus, I created an anonymous email and sent a single message to the CFO of Vance Consolidated, a man known for being a stickler. The email said, "Ask Marcus about the Phoenix Shell Corporation from 2015. The numbers don't add up." I knew from my father's journals that the CFO was the one person Marcus was terrified of. It was a small spark, but in the dry tinder of corporate finance, that's all it takes. A week later, I made my move on Amelia. Her husband was a jealous man, and his biggest professional rival was Amelia's lover. I knew he had lunch at the same exclusive club every Thursday. I arranged to be there. I didn't approach him. I just sat at a nearby table with a friend, talking just loudly enough for him to overhear. "It's amazing what you find in old books," I said, my voice carrying. "My father kept everything. Old letters even, some are quite passionate. I never knew my sister was such a romantic, especially on her trips to New York." I saw his shoulders tense. His head snapped in my direction. I gave him a small, innocent smile and turned back to my friend. I'd planted the weed of suspicion. His jealousy would do the rest. My final preliminary target was my mother. Her weakness was her social standing. Her entire identity was built on being the matriarch of a perfect family. She was hosting her annual charity gala, the pinnacle of the social calendar, an event dedicated to family values and integrity. The irony was so thick I could taste it. This would be my stage. A few days before the gala, I sent a small, anonymous package to the city's most notorious gossip columnist. It contained a single, scanned page from my father's diary, with most of the text blacked out but a few key phrases visible. A hole in the books, a wife who whispers another man's name, and an empire built on silence. At the bottom, I typed a single line. All will be revealed at the Vance Family Foundation Gala. The trap was set. The whispers started immediately. Marcus became jumpy, surely feeling the heat from the internal audit. Amelia's husband grew cold, the cracks in their marriage widening. My mother, obsessed with public perception, was on edge, trying to plug a leak without knowing where it came from. They were all looking at each other, trapped in a dark room, and I had just lit the match. They had no idea the inferno was coming. The night of the gala was electric. I bought a ticket through a third party. The grand ballroom was a glittering sea of diamonds and fake smiles. My mother stood at the entrance, a queen greeting her court with a strained smile, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd. When she saw me, her face froze. I wasn't in a meek black dress. I was in a striking, deep red gown. I looked confident, powerful, like I belonged. She saw me, but she didn't see the threat. To her, I was still the footnote. An unwelcome guest, not the executioner. I spent the first hour mingling, letting them see me. I shared a cold, knowing look with Marcus, whose face was pale and sweaty. I gave Amelia a sad, pitying smile and watched her husband glare at her from across the room. The air was thick with their fear. The main event was my mother's speech. As she took the stage, the room fell silent. She spoke eloquently about family, legacy, integrity. It was a masterful performance of hypocrisy. As she finished to polite applause, she prepared to present the Family of the Year award. That was my cue. I walked calmly to the side of the stage, where a secondary microphone was set up. Before anyone could stop me, I stepped up to it. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. My mother's face went from pale to ashen. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and steady. My mother speaks so beautifully about family, about legacy, and she's right. Legacy is important. My father believed that too. In fact, he wrote about it, a lot. I reached into my evening bag and pulled out one of my father's real journals. "My family thought they left me with nothing," I said, looking from my mother to Marcus to Amelia. "But they left me my father's voice, and tonight I think it's time we all listen to it." I opened the journal. "Let's start with my brother, Marcus," I said. "The brilliant CEO. My father wrote on October 12, 2015. Marcus confessed everything tonight, the gambling debts, the embezzlement. He has stolen millions from the company I built. I have a choice, ruin him or ruin the family name. I have chosen to bury his crime." A collective gasp went through the room. Marcus looked like he'd been hit. I continued. "He was so meticulous. He even noted the shell corporation, Phoenix, and the offshore account numbers. I'm sure the federal investigators who received a tip last week will find it all very interesting." Marcus shoved his chair back and stumbled out of the ballroom, his face a mask of horror. "And then there's my sister, Amelia," I went on, turning a page. "A pillar of marital fidelity, or is she? My father wrote, she thinks I don't know about her trips to New York. She doesn't know that I know her lover's name, a name her own husband despises. He even kept one of your letters, Amelia." I looked at her husband. "It seems her heart belongs to your biggest business rival. I believe his words were, 'My eternal secret love.'" Amelia let out a choked sob. Her husband stared at her with pure rage before turning and walking stiffly out of the room, leaving her weeping alone at the table. Finally, I turned to my mother. She stood frozen on the stage, her face a grotesque mask of fury. "And that leaves you, Mother," I said, my voice turning to ice. "The architect of it all. You thought my father's mind was failing, but it was sharper than you knew. He wrote about how you poisoned him against me. He wrote about the day you had him sign the new will. His words were, Diana and Marcus stood over me, guiding my hand. They think they have won. But you see, he knew exactly what you were, and he made a plan of his own. I held up the key to the safe deposit box. He left me his real legacy, a hidden one, built on honesty, not lies, and he left me these journals. He left me the truth. I closed the journal with a soft snap that echoed in the silence. I looked out at the shocked faces and the shattered remains of my family. My mother wanted to present an award for Family of the Year, I said, my voice ringing with finality. I'm afraid there are no longer any candidates. I placed the journal on the lectern, turned my back on my speechless mother, and walked off the stage. I didn't run. I walked slowly, deliberately, through the stunned crowd, out of the ballroom, and into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I had used my father's words. I had burned their world down, and in the ashes I was finally free. The aftermath was swift, brutal, just as I'd orchestrated. Marcus was arrested within the week. The investigation revealed the depth of his fraud, and he traded his expensive suit for a prison jumpsuit. The company, mired in scandal, was forced into a hostile takeover. The Vance name, once a symbol of power, became a disgrace. Amelia's life imploded. Her husband filed for a very public, very messy divorce. Her lover, a married man himself, abandoned her to save his own reputation. She was left with nothing but the shame my father had predicted. My mother suffered the worst fate of all in her eyes. She wasn't arrested. She was simply erased. The social circle she had spent her life cultivating turned its back on her. She became a pariah, a ghost in her own life, doomed to live in that grand, empty house with nothing but echoes. And me, I used the fortune my father left me to start over. I moved to a city where no one knew my name. I bought a small house with a garden. I started writing again. There are days I feel the weight of what I did. Revenge isn't a clean thing. It leaves scars. I destroyed my family, and no matter how monstrous they were still the only one I'd ever known. But then I remember the silence of that dusty study, the crushing weight of their cruelty, and the feel of my father's journals. He didn't ask me for vengeance. He asked for justice. He gave me a voice when they had tried to silence me forever. They built their legacy on lies, a beautiful house with a rotten foundation. I didn't burn it down. I just held up a candle and let the truth do the rest. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, but sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that need to be heard. If you've ever felt like your voice was being silenced, know that you aren't alone. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about a time you had to fight for your own truth, because sometimes that's the only fight that really matters.